Have you ever caught yourself performing your own life as if you're watching yourself from the outside? Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that stops you from functioning, but in a way that feels like there's always a quiet observer sitting behind your eyes, checking whether you're getting it right. You speak, but part of you is already scanning the room for reactions. You make choices, but somewhere inside you're calculating how those choices will be received before you even commit to them. You move through your days doing everything correctly, appropriately. And yet there's this faint but persistent sensation that the person living your life isn't fully you, but a version carefully assembled to be acceptable. Carl Jung, one of the deepest explorers of the human psyche, once pointed out that there comes a moment in psychological development when a person grows weary of this constant outward orientation. Not weary from failing, but weary from the endless act of measuring themselves against everything outside. And Jung believed this weariness is not a breakdown. It is not a sign you're falling behind. It is something far more significant. It is the first genuine signal that your inner self is asking to be let back in. This is not a video that will tell you to ignore the world or abandon your responsibilities. It will not ask you to become indifferent to the people around you. What it offers is something more subtle and far more difficult, a quiet walk through the territory of returning from living under every external gaze to living from a place that no longer needs constant validation to know it exists. If the title of this video stirred something in you, even just a flicker of recognition, it may not be random. It may be that a part of you has been waiting for permission to stop performing and simply be. Stay with this until the end, because it is entirely possible that what you have been searching for outside yourself has been sitting silently inside you all along, waiting for you to stop looking elsewhere. Section 1. The Invisible Theater. There is a phase in human life that almost everyone passes through, but very few recognize for what it truly is. It is the phase where your sense of worth becomes completely entangled with how others perceive you. A single word of praise and your entire day brightens. A moment of silence after you speak and unease creeps in. One glance that feels slightly off, and suddenly you're reviewing everything you just did, searching for what might have gone wrong. On the outside, everything continues as usual. You go to work, you meet people, you fulfill your roles. But inside, something essential has quietly shifted. The center of gravity of your inner life is no longer inside you. It has been placed outside, into the hands of a world that doesn't even know it's now carrying your sense of self. Jung observed this with remarkable clarity. He saw that when a person begins to measure their worth primarily through the responses of others, they lose what he called the deepest anchor of psychological stability. Not because other people are untrustworthy or cruel, but because you have handed over the authority to define who you are to something utterly beyond your control. At that moment, your inner world stops being guided by your own depths and starts being shaped by collective signals, social cues, and the unpredictable reactions of everyone around you. You no longer ask yourself, does this feel true for me? Instead, the question becomes, will this be accepted? But Jung was never interested in moral judgment. He did not look at this condition and call it weakness or failure. He understood it as something far more natural and inevitable. When the self has not yet been fully formed, when a person lacks a stable inner reference point, they are left with no choice but to use the external world as a mirror. Not because they are shallow, but because they have not yet developed the internal structure that allows them to see themselves directly. As Jung once wrote, and this line cuts deep if you let it, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Imagine someone trying to navigate a vast forest at night, with nothing but the movement of the crowd to guide them. If everyone turns east, they turn east. If the group pauses, they pause. Not because they have any sense that east is the right direction, but because without the crowd, they would have no sense of direction at all. Jung called this living by the collective map. You don't truly know where you're going. You only know you don't want to be left behind. And it is precisely within this state that something deeper begins to quietly unravel. Alienation in the Jungian sense is not about doing bad things or living immorally. It is something far more subtle and pervasive. Alienation is when you find yourself living increasingly far from your true nature, while simultaneously believing that you are being appropriate, successful, and completely fine. You choose a career because it carries status. You shape your personality because certain traits are admired. You build a life that looks perfectly reasonable from the outside. But underneath there is a growing sensation of emptiness, a fatigue that no amount of achievement seems to touch. This is not yet a crisis. It is something quieter. It is the first whisper of a self that has been neglected for too long. I recall a man who came for conversation about his life, though this is not therapy, just an observation of how these patterns show up. He was in his early 30s, constantly working, always praised for his dedication and success. But whenever he found himself alone, when no one was watching, when no feedback arrived, he felt a strange hollowness. He filled every silence with more work, more goals, more measurable achievement. Not because he loved what he did, but because stopping meant facing that emptiness. At the same time, he was endlessly comparing himself to people his age. Someone had published a book. Someone had started a company. Someone seemed further ahead. He never noticed that every comparison was a quiet rejection of his own unique unfolding. A process that Jung insisted is never identical between any two people. Each person carries their own rhythm of psychological development. When you live through the eyes of others, you force yourself into someone else's tempo. And when that borrowed rhythm clashes with your own inner timing, something has to give. Fatigue, disorientation, the sense that you're living someone else's life. These are not random symptoms. They are the natural consequences of a fundamental misalignment. Focusing only on yourself, from the perspective we're walking through here, is not an invitation to selfishness or isolation. It is something far more precise. It is the decision to stop using the external world as the primary source of your identity. It is the willingness to ask what actually matters to me, even if no one else sees it, even if no one approves. The moment you begin to ask that question, you are taking the first step off the collective map and toward your own compass. And if you find yourself in a moment of realization right now, if something in you is recognizing that you have lived too long under the gaze of others, do not mistake that recognition for collapse. It is not a sign that you're broken. It is something far more gentle. It is the self quietly tapping on the door, letting you know it's time to come home. Section 2. The mask that became the face. There is a moment that often arrives after the first realization. You begin to sense that you've been living through others' eyes. And then a second question follows, softer, but more unsettling. If I've been performing all this time, then who exactly has been living my life? Jung had a name for what steps into that question. He called it the persona. It is not a complicated concept, though its implications run deep. The persona is the social mask we begin learning to wear from early childhood. We learn to smile when expected, to speak in certain ways, to suppress what might be rejected. The persona is not created to deceive or harm. It is created to help us survive in a social world that demands conformity. The trouble begins not when we wear the mask, but when we forget it is a mask. When we start believing that the persona is who we really are. Jung was careful to point out that the persona was never designed to carry the weight of meaning in a human life. It is a tool for interaction, not a foundation for existence. But when you begin seeking your sense of worth, your identity, your deepest security through that mask, something fundamental goes wrong. You stop living from the inside out and start living to maintain an image. And the more tightly you cling to that image, the further you drift from anything real. The fear of being judged is what slowly transforms the persona from protection into prison. In the beginning, it seems reasonable. You just want to avoid conflict, avoid rejection, avoid the discomfort of being seen as difficult. So you adjust your words to be inoffensive. You manage your emotions to appear stable. You make choices that won't disappoint anyone. But gradually, something shifts. You begin to feel that you are no longer allowed to step outside this role. Any thought that doesn't fit creates anxiety. Any impulse toward authenticity feels threatening. The persona no longer protects you from the world. It now protects the world from your real self. Jung put it with his usual precision when he wrote, "The persona is that which in reality one is not, but which oneself as well as others think one is." When identification with the persona becomes complete, you are no longer living your life. You are living the life of an image. And from that condition, a very specific form of addiction emerges. Addiction to recognition. You need praise to feel okay. You need positive feedback to know you're on the right track. Not because you're vain or superficial, but because you have placed your entire sense of worth into something that was never meant to hold it. I think of someone I knew, a woman who worked in a field where image mattered. Everyone described her as pleasant, professional, easy to be around. She knew exactly how to navigate conversations, what to post, what to say, what version of herself to present, so that no one ever felt uncomfortable. But in a quiet conversation, she admitted something that had been bothering her for years. She no longer knew what she actually enjoyed. Every time she felt a genuine preference or desire, a voice would immediately interrupt with questions. Will this seem strange? Will people be disappointed? Will I still be accepted? She wasn't living badly. She was living carefully. But the cost of that care was the gradual disappearance of any real sense of self. Her anxiety wasn't coming from failure. It was coming from having no space left where the mask could be removed. No relationship, no moment, no part of her life where she could simply exist without monitoring how she was being received. Focusing only on yourself, in this context, does not mean rejecting all social roles or declaring war on politeness. Jung never advocated for that kind of crude rebellion. What he pointed toward was something more subtle and more difficult. It is the practice of beginning to recognize what is persona and what is self. It is the courage to see that certain ways of living exist only to secure acceptance, not because they arise from any inner truth. And when you begin to loosen the persona, even slightly, anxiety will appear, because you are stepping away from a familiar zone of safety. But Jung understood this anxiety differently than most. He did not see it as a sign of danger. He saw it as evidence that you are touching something real. Each time you choose not to perform perfectly, each time you let the mask slip, you will feel uneasy. But alongside that unease, something else begins to form. A feeling of lightness, a sensation of aliveness. Not dramatic, not explosive, but quietly present. You do not need to destroy the persona overnight. What Jung suggested was not the elimination of all social masks, but the cessation of allowing the mask to govern your inner world. When you begin to focus on yourself, you learn to listen to your own inner response before calculating external reaction. You allow yourself, in small moments, to not be recognized, in order to preserve something more important. Inner honesty, and from that gradual withdrawal of attention from the outer world, a quiet rebalancing begins. If something in this section resonates, if you recognize the experience of living correctly but not truly living, that recognition is not an accident. It is the persona loosening. Just slightly. Just enough for you to feel the difference. Section 3. The race that was never yours. When you begin to loosen the grip of the persona, when you stop living entirely for acceptance, an old habit often returns with renewed force. You look sideways. You check where others are. You measure your progress against theirs. Someone has moved faster. Someone has achieved more. Someone seems to have figured things out while you're still figuring. And before you realize it, you are caught again. Not in the need for approval, but in something that looks like motivation, but feels like exhaustion. Comparison. Jung saw comparison not as a simple case of jealousy or insecurity, but as something psychologically deeper. He understood that when you compare yourself to others, you are not just feeling inadequate. You are actively denying your own individual path. You are declaring, without saying it aloud, that your unique process of becoming is invalid simply because it does not match someone else's timeline. No two psychological journeys are the same. Jung was adamant about this. Each person carries a unique unconscious structure, a distinct rhythm of maturation, a particular set of inner necessities that cannot be rushed or copied. But society does not operate on this understanding. Society creates shared expectations. By this age, you should have achieved certain things. By this stage, you should be stable. By this point, you should have arrived. And when you measure your life against these collective milestones, you stop listening to your own inner process and begin forcing yourself into a schedule that was never designed for you. Jung did not call this motivation. He called it misdirection. Think of someone running in a race that was not of their choosing. At the start, they simply wanted to move forward, to find their own direction. But surrounded by the sound of others' footsteps, something shifts. They begin to speed up not because they want to go faster, but because they fear falling behind. They change direction not because the new path is right, but because everyone else seems to be taking it. Eventually, they collapse, exhausted, in a place that was never their destination. Comparison works exactly like this. When you live within a race, you expend your energy on speed while what you actually need is direction. I remember a man who came to a point of crisis in his 40s. For years, he had measured himself against his peers. They had promotions, houses, families that looked stable. He had changed jobs repeatedly, moved cities, followed interests that seemed to lead nowhere. Every reunion with old friends left him feeling like he had missed something essential. But during a period when he was forced to stop, when life slowed him down whether he wanted it or not, he began to see something he had never noticed. He had never been lost. He had simply been walking a different path. Slower by social standards, but deeper in ways that could not be measured by external metrics. When he stopped comparing and started paying attention to what actually mattered to him, the weight began to lift. Not because he finally caught up, but because he stopped running altogether. Jung wrote something that cuts to the heart of this. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But you cannot become who you are if you are constantly measuring yourself against who someone else is. Comparison places you on a timeline that does not belong to you. It causes you to misread the necessary phases of your own life. Periods of slowing down, of getting lost, of failing, phases that Jung considered essential to genuine growth, are labeled as problems simply because they don't match the collective schedule. There is an old story from Greek mythology that carries this truth in image form. Achilles, the greatest warrior, was invincible only as long as he followed his own destiny. But when he became preoccupied with glory as defined by others, when he stepped onto the stage of collective recognition, he exposed his one vulnerable point and fell. Through a Jungian lens, this is the image of a person abandoning their individual path to chase a collective version of success. And the price, as the story shows, is always high. Focusing only on yourself, at this stage of the journey, does not mean turning away from the world or cutting yourself off from community. It means something more precise. It means stopping the use of other people's lives as the measuring stick for your own process. It means understanding that not having arrived by society's standards does not mean you are failing. It may mean you are being prepared for a different kind of maturity altogether. Forgetting others, in the true sense we're walking through here, means forgetting their timelines. It means no longer asking, where am I compared to them? And returning to a far more important question. Am I aligned with myself? When you begin to focus on that question, the race dissolves, not because you win or lose, but because you realize you were never meant to be in it at all. And it is precisely when you step out of comparison that your own path becomes visible. Not clearer because the fog lifts, but clearer because you finally stop staring at everyone else's road and look down at your own. Section 4. The voice that was never theirs. There is a stage in this process that often surprises people. You stop comparing. You stop chasing approval. You loosen the persona. And yet, something remains. A persistent unease. A sensitivity to how others might be perceiving you. A comment lingers too long. A silence feels heavy. You tell yourself you no longer care what people think. But somewhere underneath, the old fear of judgment is still active. This is not a contradiction. It is a sign that you have reached a deeper layer of the journey. The layer where projection has not yet been withdrawn. Jung understood that much of what we experience as judgment from others is not actually coming from outside. It is being projected outward from within. Projection is the mind's way of taking material that is too uncomfortable to own and attributing it to someone else. When a feeling is too difficult to accept, the psyche unconsciously places it onto the world. We believe they are thinking about us, scrutinizing us, finding us lacking. But often, it is our own inner voice speaking, disguised as the world. Jung wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." The fear of being judged operates through this same mechanism. You may be convinced that others are harsh toward you. But look closer. Who is it that will not allow you to make mistakes? Who is constantly whispering that you are not good enough, not fast enough, not together enough? Very often it is not anyone outside. It is a part of you. The shadow, the repressed and denied aspect of your own psyche. When the shadow is not acknowledged, it does not disappear. It continues to influence how you interpret the world, coloring every interaction with its unspoken content. I think of a woman who was convinced her colleagues did not respect her. She felt that every question carried doubt. Every piece of feedback was criticism. She was tense at work, always waiting for the next slight. But when she began to turn inward, when she started examining not their behavior but her own internal landscape, she discovered something she had been carrying for years. A deep belief that she was not good enough. That belief had never been spoken aloud, never fully confronted. It lived underneath her conscious awareness, shaping everything. And because she could not accept it as something within herself that needed attention, she projected it outward, believing others were thinking it for her. When she began to face her own self-doubt directly, something shifted. The outside world seemed less hostile. Not because her colleagues changed, but because the projection was withdrawn. Modern psychology confirms what Jung described decades ago. The brain interprets ambiguous information according to existing beliefs. If you carry an internal schema that says, "I am likely to be judged," you become hypervigilant to tones, glances, and silences. Your brain fills in the gaps with what it already expects to find. The world you fear is often a mirror of what you have not yet faced within yourself. When you begin to integrate the shadow, allowing yourself to see and dialogue with the parts you have denied, a fundamental shift occurs. External voices lose their power, not because you become indifferent, but because you no longer need others to carry your unresolved inner conflicts. You can hear criticism without collapsing. You can face disagreement without feeling threatened. You have taken responsibility for your own inner world. Focusing only on yourself, at this depth, is no longer about withdrawing from society or ignoring what others think. It is the act of reclaiming the psychological energy you have unconsciously given away. Every time you worry about being judged, that energy flows outward. When you turn back and ask, which part of me is saying this, you bring that energy home. Jung saw this as the transition from living in reaction to the world to living in dialogue with yourself. Forgetting others, in this context, does not mean denying their existence. It means stopping the use of them as mirrors for what you have not yet accepted. When you no longer need the world to carry your unowned material, the world becomes more neutral, less threatening. And in that neutrality, a new kind of freedom emerges. When projection is withdrawn, you stop asking, "Who is judging me?" and begin asking, "What within me wants to be seen?" The moment you dare to stay with that question, you take a very deep step on the path back to yourself. Section 5. The silence that speaks. When you reach the point where the world's gaze no longer dominates your inner landscape, something unexpected happens. Life slows down, not in a frustrating way, but in a way that feels almost unfamiliar. The noise that once filled your mind begins to settle, and in that settling you encounter something you may have been avoiding for a long time. Solitude. Most people misunderstand solitude. They confuse it with loneliness, with abandonment, with something lacking. But Jung saw solitude differently. For him, solitude was not emptiness. It was space. Sacred space where the soul can finally speak without being drowned out by the voices of others. He once wrote, and this is worth sitting with, "Loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you." When you have lived too long under the gaze of others, you rarely hear what is truly important to yourself. Withdrawing from constant social engagement is not escape. It is a necessary condition for inner truth to surface. When you are perpetually responding to the expectations, emotions, and opinions of others, the self has no room to breathe. You may function efficiently. You may integrate smoothly. But inside, there remains a quiet space that has never been visited. And because that space feels unfamiliar, even frightening, many people fill it with constant activity, constant connection, constant noise. Imagine a lake early in the morning. When wind blows across the surface, the water is constantly moving, reflecting distorted images. You cannot see what lies beneath. But when the wind calms, when the surface grows still, the depths become visible. Psychological life follows the same pattern. When you are constantly surrounded by the voices of others, you see only fleeting reflections. But when you dare to be alone, when you stop reacting, deeper layers of yourself begin to emerge. The silence does not create what is true. It only allows what is true to be heard. There is a well-known story of a man who built one of the most influential companies of his time. But before that, there was a period when he was pushed out of everything he had created. From the outside, it looked like failure. From the inside, it was something else entirely. He traveled. He sat in silence. He stopped chasing and started listening. It was during that solitary period that many of the ideas he later became known for began to take shape. Not because he found them outside, but because he finally created space for them inside. From a Jungian perspective, this is what solitude does. It creates the conditions for the self to restructure. What makes people afraid of being alone is not the absence of others. It is what might surface when there is no one left to distract them. In silence, the questions you have been avoiding begin to appear. Genuine desires, unacknowledged grief, inner conflicts that social life helps you forget. Jung considered this necessary. Only when you dare to stay with these contents do you have the chance to integrate them, rather than continuing to project them outward. Focusing only on yourself does not mean cutting off all relationships or becoming a hermit. It means temporarily withdrawing attention from the outside long enough to reestablish inner order. You do not need to disappear from the world, but you do need periods of silence deep enough that you are no longer pulled by comparison or judgment. When you are alone without trying to fill the time, you give the self an opportunity to reorganize your life from the inside. Forgetting others, in this sense, is not antisocial. It is the only way to return to center. When you no longer need others to validate you or serve as the backdrop for your identity, you begin to stand more firmly in every interaction. You do not cling. You do not overreact. You do not lose yourself in relationships. True solitude does not distance you from people. It allows you to be more fully present when you return to them. When you can be in silence without panic, when you can be alone without feeling lack. That is not a small thing. It is a sign that the self has begun to take its rightful place in your life. And from that inner foundation, you return to the world not to seek, but to live, not to be seen, but to be present, not to chase anyone, but to walk in alignment with your own deepest rhythm. Section 6. The discipline no one sees. At a certain point on this journey, something shifts from understanding to practice. You have recognized the persona. You have withdrawn from comparison. You have begun to see your projections. You have made space for solitude. But now a different kind of question arises. How do you live from this new place consistently? Not in dramatic moments of insight, but in the ordinary flow of days. Jung had a name for what is required here. He called it inner necessity. Not discipline imposed from outside, not effort driven by fear of falling behind, but a discipline that emerges from deep within, because it has become clear that there is no other way to live. Jung never admired frantic doing. He distinguished clearly between action driven by what he called the extroverted ego and action rooted in the self. When the extroverted ego leads, you act to be seen, to be recognized, to be validated. The rhythm of your life is dictated by external feedback. But when action arises from inner necessity, you act because something inside demands to be realized. Even if no one watches, even if no one praises, even if no one understands. Jung wrote, "The shoe that fits one person pinches another. There is no recipe for living that suits all cases." True discipline cannot come from a universal formula. It only appears when you begin listening to your own rhythm. Think of a tree. The roots grow deep underground. No one sees them. No one praises them. They are not impressive to look at. But they determine whether the tree can withstand storms. If you spend all your energy shaping the branches, making the canopy look appealing, the tree may appear fine until the first strong wind arrives. Jungian discipline is not about making the visible parts of your life more impressive. It is about returning daily to nourish the invisible roots. I think of someone who worked in a high-pressure environment, constantly driven by goals tied to recognition. After burning out, he made a choice that looked strange from the outside. He didn't quit everything. He didn't launch into a dramatic self-improvement campaign. He simply began waking a little earlier each day. He read for a short time. He wrote a few lines of reflection. He focused on one task that mattered without telling anyone about it. No one praised him. No one even knew. But over time, he noticed something changing. He was calmer. His decisions felt clearer. The pressure of the outside world still existed, but it no longer swept him away. He had not become better than others. He had become more aligned with himself. Modern research supports what Jung observed decades ago. Intrinsic motivation is far more sustainable than extrinsic motivation. When you act for rewards, for surveillance, for evaluation, the brain fatigues quickly and requires increasing stimulation. But when action is connected to personal meaning and inner coherence, the nervous system maintains a stable focus. Psychic energy flows consistently only when it serves the process of becoming yourself. Focusing only on yourself, at this stage, is no longer about turning away from the world. It is about establishing a new order of priorities. You invest in yourself not to surpass others, but to avoid betraying what you know to be true. You may do less than others. You may move slower than others. But each step carries weight. This discipline is often lonely because it does not produce a compelling story. There are no immediate achievements. There is no applause. And precisely because of that, it remains undisturbed. True growth, from the perspective we're walking through, is almost always silent. It does not look like a breakthrough. It looks like quiet accumulation. Each day you choose to do what is necessary, without being pushed. Each time you keep your word to yourself in very small matters, you strengthen your inner center. When that center becomes solid, you act in the world without being dragged by it. When inner life is disciplined, you no longer need excessive external control. You do not have to force yourself to try harder, because the energy is already there. You do not need to prove because the direction is clear. And it is precisely then that you realize a paradox. The more deeply you focus on yourself, the more steadily you are present in life. Quiet, unshowy, but with weight. This is the discipline no one sees, yet it supports everything. Section 7. The freedom of not needing. What happens when you have built this inner discipline? When you have withdrawn from comparison? When you have loosened the persona? When you have sat in solitude and faced your projections? Something subtle but profound begins to shift. You notice that you are no longer waiting for validation, waiting for recognition, waiting for someone to confirm that you are on the right path. And in the absence of that waiting, a new quality of being emerges. Not indifference, not coldness, but a quiet freedom. Jung understood this as the maturation of the ego. When the ego is young, it needs reflection to know it exists. Praise, attention, positive feedback. These serve as mirrors through which the ego takes shape. But the ego is not meant to remain in that state forever. As it matures, it no longer requires the world to constantly tell it that it is okay. It begins to stand on a different foundation. Inner unity. At this point, value no longer comes from how much you have, how many people recognize you, or where you stand in any social order. Value comes from a deep internal sense that what you live, what you think, what you do, are not in conflict with one another. There is coherence. There is alignment. And that alignment becomes its own validation. Many people misunderstand this. They hear focus on yourself and think it means selfishness, arrogance, withdrawal. But from the perspective we're walking through, withdrawing energy from the world is not turning away from others. It is stopping the use of them as a source of your worth. When you still need validation, a portion of your psychic energy is still flowing outward, waiting to be returned in the form of praise or attention. Your emotional life remains externally regulated, even if you appear independent on the surface. I recall someone who had done deep work on herself. She had moved beyond comparison. She was no longer overly afraid of judgment. Her inner life was relatively solid. But she noticed something. Whenever she shared something she had created, a painting, a piece of writing, a project that mattered to her, she still unconsciously checked for reactions. Not because she was weak, but because a part of her was still asking, is this good enough to be seen? When she finally caught that movement and stopped, not by forcing indifference, but by returning to the inner experience of creating, something shifted. She no longer rose or fell with others' responses. The work remained the same. But her emotions were lighter. She had not lost motivation. She had lost dependence. Jung wrote something that can be difficult to hear, but is essential to this stage. The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely, To fully accept yourself means you no longer need anyone else to bear witness to your value. This is frightening for an immature ego because it is accustomed to being nourished by feedback. But for an ego that has passed through enough experience, this becomes liberation. You no longer need to prove because there is no longer any part inside demanding reassurance. Think of psychic energy as water. When you constantly seek validation, that water flows outward, spreading thin across the surface. When you withdraw the energy, it does not disappear. It seeps into the ground, nourishing the roots. No one sees the water underground, but it determines whether the tree survives drought. Inner value is the same. It does not need to be displayed. But when it is deep enough, all outward action becomes stable. Emotional independence, in the Jungian sense, does not mean needing no one. It means not being shaken by whether others respond or not. When the self begins to coordinate life, your emotions no longer rise and fall with external gazes. You can receive praise without excessive excitement. You can face criticism without collapse. Not because you are numb, but because the center of regulation has shifted from outside to inside. Focusing only on yourself at this final stage is no longer an effort. It becomes a natural state. You do not need to try to forget others, because when energy has been withdrawn inward, others naturally lose their influence. You are not concerned with proving you are right. You do not need anyone to confirm that you are on the right path. You know, not intellectually, but through a deep sense of inner coherence. This is a very particular moment of psychological maturity. The moment when you realize you are no longer living to be seen, not to be recognized, but also not to betray what you know to be true. The world is still there. People are still there. But they no longer hold authority over your inner life. And in that very quiet withdrawal, a rare form of freedom appears. A freedom that does not need to oppose anyone or surpass anyone, because you are no longer standing on the same axis of measurement. Section 8. The return that was never leaving. So where does this journey lead? Not to a destination you can mark on a map. Not to a state where you never again care what anyone thinks. Not to perfection or permanent peace. Something quieter. Something that has been true all along, but was hidden beneath the noise of seeking. Focusing only on yourself was never an act of rebellion. It was never a cold withdrawal or a rejection of the world. It was a return. A very quiet return of attention from the outside to the inside. A shift of the center of living from external validation to internal coherence. When you no longer need the world to confirm who you are, when you no longer require others' gazes as proof of your value, you begin to stand on different ground. Not better ground, not higher ground, just ground that is your own. And from that ground, life does not necessarily become easier, but it becomes truer. You no longer have to live fast to keep up. You no longer have to live correctly to be accepted. You no longer have to live big to be seen. You only need to live in alignment with what is moving most deeply within you. And paradoxically, it is precisely when you stop seeking your place in the world that the world no longer has the power to shake you. If this walk through these ideas has stirred something in you, if it has touched a feeling you have carried but never named, that is not an accident. It is the self, reminding you that it is still there, still waiting, still ready to be lived, not as a better version of you for the world, but as you. Finally,